Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar workshop, where we will be discussing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action and how we as educators can work towards reconciliation through education. We would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories on which we gather. For centuries, this land has been a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Dene, and the Nakota Sioux First Nations. We also acknowledge the Métis Nation of Alberta and all people who make their home in Treaty Regions 4, 6, 7, and 8. As educators, citizens, and allies, we wish to acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us in an effort to pave the way for reconciliation through education. So there are quite a few outcomes of this workshop. We're going to have you doing a lot of personal and professional reflection throughout the workshop, mostly on our current professional readiness to create awareness, understanding, and application of Indigenous foundational knowledge and teaching about the history and legacy of residential schools. We're going to be going over quite a few different planning tools that can help you in designing comprehensive plans to create awareness, understanding, and application of this knowledge, and learn about how the implementation of this knowledge seeks to benefit all students, not just our FNMI students, but all students in our classroom through culturally responsive pedagogy and intercultural teaching methods. And we're going to learn about Indigenous resources and supports that could be embedded into your school and classroom plan. And last but not least, we're going to have you create your own professional plan of action to begin implementing Indigenous perspectives into your classroom.
Reconciliation begins with education. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada published its 94 calls to action in 2016. They appeal to all sectors of society to change, to improve, and to educate. The Commission calls on us to reconcile with Canada's Indigenous peoples so as to avoid repeating history. As educators, we have an obligation to affect change. Our hope is to demonstrate why change is required and explore ways on how one can implement such change. Please take a moment to watch this brief video.
Hello everybody, I'm Murray Sinclair. I'm the Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the issue of reconciliation, something which of course is very important to us here at the Commission, but also is of interest and importance to a lot of people in Canada. One of the things that we at the Commission have discovered is that it took us a long time to get to this point in terms of the relationship between Aboriginal people in this country. 7 generations of children went through the residential schools. And each of those children who were educated were told that their lives were not as good as the lives of the non-Aboriginal people of this country. They were told that their languages, their cultures were irrelevant. They were told that their people and their ancestors were heathens and pagans and uncivilized and needed to give up that way of life to come to a different way of living. At the same time that was going on, non-Aboriginal children in the non-Aboriginal school systems of this country were also being told the same thing about Aboriginal people. So as a result, many generations of children, including you and your parents, have been raised to think about things in a different way, in the wrong way, in a way that is negative when it comes to Aboriginal people. And we need to change that. It was the educational system that has contributed to this problem in this country, and it's the educational system we believe that's going to help us to get away from this. We need to look at the way that we educate children. We need to look at the way that we educate ourselves. We need to look at what it is that our textbooks say about Aboriginal people. We need to look at what it is that Aboriginal people themselves are allowed to say within the educational system about their own histories. In addition to that, we also believe that what's important when it comes to looking at the way that children are educated is to understand that because it took us so many generations to get to this point, it's going to take us at least a few generations to be able to say that we are making progress. We cannot look for quick and easy solutions because there are none. We need to be able to look at this from the perspective of where do we want to be in 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 generations from now when we talk about the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. And if we can agree on what that relationship needs to look like in the future, then what we need to think about is what can we do today that will contribute to that objective. Reconciliation will be about ensuring that everything that we do today is aimed at that high standard of restoring that balance to that relationship?
The impacts of the residential school experience are intergenerational. They have been passed on from generation to generation. Parents who were forced to send their children to the schools had to deal with the devastating effects of separation and a total lack of input in the care and welfare of their own children. Many children suffered abuse, atrocities from the staff that were compounded by a curriculum that stripped them of their native languages and culture. This caused additional feelings of alienation, shame, and anger that were passed down to their children and grandchildren.
So, after that brief history of residential schools, it's important now to discuss what we can do in the future. And this is where we come and talk about Truth and Reconciliation, and specifically the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So, it's a call to action for basically all Canadians. And that's why we represented this slide with this citation, with this quote, that it's not only Aboriginal issues, but they're real issues for us as Canadians as well. And it's only through reconciliation, discussion, and respect that we will actually see future change. What does truth and reconciliation look like? As we know, education has a very important influence on our future generations. So it's important to mention what steps are being taken by the government, what specifically is being done to implement real and authentic change. So I'm not going to read every sentence here, but I think it's important for us to take a moment and read through 62 to 65 on the slide you see before you. Basically, what it's focusing on is on education and how to effectively implement that education in an effective way. So that comes through collaboration. And that comes through collaboration through the communities as a whole and the Aboriginal community in respect to elders, and focusing on not only education as we know it as kind of a Western-based philosophy, but incorporating Aboriginal perspective as well. The focus should be on an early education, but also extend to all the way to grade 12. So it's a continuous progress. And the idea here is to really to connect and interweave the Aboriginal perspective with the traditional, more traditional Western perspective on education. So it's through that collaboration, through discussion, that we will really make change by implementing outcomes in the curriculum. At this time, we'd like to ask for you just to stop and kind of reflect on what we've covered so far. And to do that, we're encouraging you to think about two questions. The first is, why do you feel it is important to build teacher capacity around foundational knowledge about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit? And secondly, why do you feel it is important to build teacher capacity around the history and the legacy of residential schooling in Canada? So if you please just take a moment to reflect on those two questions and to think about the history and where we're going as a profession, but also as a society as well in the future. So the next slide you'll see here is changes the Alberta curriculum and teacher quality standards. So now we're seeing a change, an official change from the government and focusing on teacher education. So we've talked about student education and obviously how it's important for students to gain knowledge and perspective on Aboriginal perspectives. But it's also now a part of our professional duty to be accepting of these changes. So as you see on the slide here, we included a quote by Murray Sinclair, the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to give you an idea of what we're feeling right now and how the government feels about teacher education. And on the right-hand side, with supporting the application of foundational knowledge about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, we're discussing what specifically, what attitudes, what behaviors need to be seen at the teacher level, at the school level, at the system level, for real change to occur. This happens with teachers' attitudes, but also knowledge as well. As we've discussed at length during the course, most teachers want to change and want to incorporate ideas, Aboriginal perspectives in class. Now it's part of our teaching profession to actively search and actively acquire knowledge on how to best incorporate Aboriginal perspective in our classrooms.
In face with the changes to Alberta curriculum and teacher quality standard, we might want to pause here to reflect on the following two questions. First, how confident are you in your teaching and leadership capacity to enable school staff, your colleagues, and students to gain knowledge, understanding, and respect for First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit? To be specific, how can you help them to understand and appreciate the history, culture, languages of FNMI communities? And how can you help them to understand FNMI people's contribution to the human civilization, to understand their perspectives about life, their way of thinking, and to learn about the current living conditions of those people? Second, as an educator, how can you do to help your colleagues and students to develop an understanding towards the history and legacy of those residential schools? After watching the video about residential schools, how can you help them to understand the impact of the intergenerational trauma on learner development? As we all know, some teachers might feel worried about talking about issues related to FNMI in classes because they are afraid to say something wrong. However, based on our introduction and discussion, it is clearly understood that there is a need for teachers to include the fundamental knowledge in their teaching practices. So when teachers are ready to do so, when teachers can shake off the anxiety of saying something wrong and include knowledge about FNMI in classes, from our perspective, we think that teachers' readiness to address such issues lies in their readiness in two perspectives. First is their capacity of knowing about FNMI. That includes they have the basic knowledge about history, culture, perspectives, etc. And the second is their willingness to take extra training to foster such kind of ability, and their willingness to address reconciliation through education. To address reconciliation through education, there are indeed some challenges faced by teachers and schools. For example, teachers have limited control over the funding allotted to address FNMI issues. They might have limited opportunities to acquire knowledge about FNMI through professional development, or they might have limited access and resources about FNMI. Their students might have a certain kind of stereotype thinking about their Aboriginal classmates, and so do their parents, which might make them unwilling to know about FNMI cultures. But teachers do have things under control to make the implementation happen. That is our willingness. We have our own personal willingness to address reconciliation through education by implementing these changes in education policies, curricula, priorities, program, and initiatives, such as what they do to the Alberta curriculum. And we also control our intention to enhance our professional capacity and foundation knowledge about First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit, even though limited opportunities are placed in front of us. And that is one of our aims of this presentation, which is to provide you with more resources and supports of success implementation in classrooms. The first two figures in this slide are retrieved from a guidebook called A Guide to Support Implementation Essential Conditions. It was developed by a provincial working group of education partners committed to realizing positive changes in Alberta's school and classrooms. According to the guidebook, successful implementation is possible when education stakeholders share responsibility to address these 7 essential conditions: shared vision, leadership, research and evidence, resources, teacher professional growth, time, and community engagement. Figure 1 names the 7 essential conditions, identifies the education stakeholders involved in collaboratively addressing these essential conditions, and depicts the culture of learning within which education policies, curriculum, programs, initiatives, and priorities are implemented. Based on Figure 1, teachers, as one of the education stakeholders, have the responsibility to address essential conditions about resources. Successful implementation requires system coherence. This complex work requires coherence among plans and priorities. Provincial policy requires that all certificated teachers develop annual professional growth plans based on self-assessment of their learning needs relative to the teaching quality standard. School boards and jurisdictions are required to develop annual education plans. Professional growth plans and annual education plans may consider involving provincial educational goals. Annual education plans need to be specified how jurisdiction professional developed plans will support implementation of school board and provincial goals. Figure 2 illustrates the need to build coherence among all of these plans to improve professional practice focused on enhancing students' learning. Therefore, in the context of achieving basic FNMI knowledge instruction in class, all the 4 perspectives need to work collaboratively. This similar system is also shown in the third figure of this slide about support and enhance FNMI students' achievement and success. 5 essential elements of culturally responsive teaching are examined in Gay's paper. They are including ethnic and culturally diverse content in the curriculum, developing a knowledge base about cultural diversity, demonstrating caring and building learning communities, communicating with the ethnically diverse students, and responding to ethnic diversity in the delivery of instruction. In this presentation, we extract 4 perspectives that are closely related to the topic for detailed elaboration. They are relevant curriculum, knowledge base, building a culturally responsive learning community, and classroom instruction. In the paper published by Geneva Gay in 2002, culturally responsive teaching approach was introduced to improve the school success of ethnically diverse students through culturally responsive teaching and to prepare teachers in Preserver's education program with the knowledge, attitude, and skills needed to do this. It is defined as using the cultural characteristics, experience, and perspectives of ethnically diverse students as conduits for teaching them more efficiently. It is based on the assumption that when academic knowledge and skills are situated within the lived experience and frames of reference of students, they are more personally meaningful and have higher interest appeal and are learned more easily and thoroughly. As a result, the academic achievement of ethnically diverse students will improve when they are taught through their own culture and experiential filters.
Currently, as we discussed, the government is taking action by making those changes at the curriculum level. So the Alberta government is currently revamping subject curriculum across all subject matter. In general, while different subjects have differing curriculum completion dates, the goal of the government is to complete the new curriculum development by 2021. A primary goal and focus is to be inclusive, and being part of the social studies curriculum development with the government, being part of the cohort group. This is I've definitely noticed this. There's a representation of various perspectives, which is really good to see. I've been in the past, I've been in different cohort groups where it's mainly been teachers and kind of status quo teachers, not much experience. A lot of them from larger centers, cities, Edmonton, Calgary, that type of thing. But this time, when I went in April, it was quite different. We had elders, we had different stakeholders from various parts of the community that were actively participating and voicing their concerns on new curriculum development. So it was really good to see.
The second essential element of culturally responsive teaching is building a knowledge base. Effective teaching requires mastery of content knowledge and pedagogical skills. We simply cannot teach what we don't know. Part of this knowledge includes understanding the cultural characteristics and contributions of different ethnic groups, and in our case, Indigenous cultures. Here are some of the most important elements to help you become more culturally aware. First and most important thing is to be aware of ethnic groups' cultural values, traditions, communication, learning styles, and contributions. The second requirement for developing a knowledge base for culturally responsive teaching is acquiring detailed factual information about the cultural practices of specific ethnic groups. This is very difficult with Indigenous cultures because their histories, rather than having been passed down through books and the written word, are known by more traditional methods such as storytelling. This makes their history somewhat difficult to find. However, as the curriculum changes move forward, more and more information is being shared about Indigenous cultures and histories. In order to help teachers find much needed resources to build their knowledge base with respect to Indigenous perspectives and the new curriculum changes, we have created a handout with a plethora of resources on it. Most of these resources can be used across the grade levels, although some modifications and adaptations might be necessary. We have also linked possible lesson plans to help teach these sensitive subject areas with specific resources. Use this resource as a starting point in building your knowledge. Additionally, there are many MOOCs, which are massive online open courses that one can sign up for to help gain additional knowledge. Most of them are free and can be done at your own pace. We all come to the classroom with our own versions of information. What we know about a certain culture is often based on superficial or distorted information conveyed through popular culture, mass media, and critics. With these resources, we hope that teachers will have an open mind and gain some insight into the history of our first.
A third critical competency of preparing for culturally responsive teaching is creating classroom climate that are conducive to learning for ethnically diverse students. This is as important as the multicultural curriculum design in the implementing culturally responsive pedagogy. Teachers need to know how to use cultural scaffolding in the teaching these students. That is, using their own culture and experiences to expand their intellectual horizon and academic achievement. Teachers have to care so much about ethnically diverse students and their achievement that they accept nothing less than high-level success from them and work diligently to accomplish it. Culturally responsive caring also places teachers in an ethnical, emotional, and academic partnership with the ethnically diverse students, a partnership that is anchored in respect, honor, integrity, resource sharing, and a deep belief in the possibility of transcendence. The process of building culturally responsive communication of learning is important for teachers to know. The emphasis should be on integrated learning. Contrary to the tendency in conventional teaching to make different types of learning discrete, culturally responsive teaching deals with them in concrete. Personal, moral, social, political, cultural, and academic knowledge and skills are taught simultaneously. For example, students are taught their cultural heritage and positive ethnic identity development along with math, science, reading, critical thinking, and social activism. They also are taught about the heritage, cultures, and contribution of their ethnic groups as they are learning their own. Culturally responsive teachers help students to understand that knowledge has moral and political elements and consequences, which obligates them to take social action to promote freedom, equality, and justice for everyone. To build a culturally responsive learning community, we believe the culture sustaining pedagogy would also be adopted. Multiple language and dialects use should be encouraged in classroom communication. By encouraging a variety of language approaches, Aboriginal students could connect with their classmates in more meaningful ways. According to research findings, teachers who are knowledgeable about and responsive to the cultural and linguistic diversity of learner can significantly affect students' academic performances, retention rates, and sense of belonging. The key for teachers to use their intercultural ability to serve diverse learners, schools, families, and communities based on our understanding lies in their decision-making in intercultural teaching. According to the research conducted by Dr. McPherson, there are two types of teachers' decision-making in intercultural teaching. The first one is minding process through attention, reflection, awareness, and critical thinking. The second is responding process as empathy, compassion, action, and the willingness and ability to respond and to assume responsibility. On the left side of this figure, the gerund minding refers to mindfulness and thinking. It involves the act of paying attention and learning through inquiry and reflection. 4 acts of intercultural minding in teaching were identified: making choices, enabling language and culture, respecting and sharing power, and arbitrating and agonizing what is just. Dr. McPherson's research suggested that minding decision-making activities in diverse schools were more apparent in early year and middle year schools. On the right side of this figure, responding decision are responses to events in the environment, in contrast to minding decision that arise through introspection. It demands more of a teacher's attention to make changes. There are 4 subcategories under it: fostering intercultural communities, opening safe spaces, protecting students and surroundings, and stepping up to address it. According to Dr. McPherson's research, the response in this category are more evenly distributed across different school levels. A further detailed elaboration will be based on such framework as shown in this figure.
So, keeping in mind this theory of culturally responsive pedagogy and intercultural teaching, what does this actually look like within a K-12 setting? So, we know, as suggested by the research, classroom instruction and more specifically intercultural teaching methods have the most potential to positively or negatively impact our diverse students. So we're going to attempt to take this intercultural teaching framework provided by McPherson and provide teachers with useful and practical resources for addressing reconciliation through education within this theory. Alberta Education states that the effective infusion of Aboriginal content goes hand in hand with a learning process that reflects the tenets of Aboriginal education. With this in mind, we encourage you to consider the following resources with a teacher as facilitator mindset. Project-based learning is a time-generous rather than a time-limited approach that is cooperative rather than competitive. It also incorporates a holistic approach, encourages observation, is experiential, is based in community resources, and considers multiple perspectives. Moving from teacher as expert to teacher as facilitator requires teachers to relinquish some control. And this may be uncomfortable at first, but recognizing that we are not and cannot be experts on this topic is the first step to meaningfully integrating it into our classroom. McPherson's framework for intercultural teaching is separated into two types of decision-making: minding and responding. Minding decisions come from introspection and the act of paying attention and learning through inquiry. It requires awareness and attention. Responding decisions are responses to events in the environment through empathy, compassion, action, and the willingness and ability to respond and to assume responsibility. Each decision-making type is further separated into subcategories, which we will explore separately through these resources.
Quote, implementing a change, real intercultural and authentic change. And the first one we're going to discuss is making choices. So making choices is basically being aware of making choices about materials, curriculum, interactions, and other aspects of life that might otherwise be ignored. And to me, when I read this and tried to understand the meaning, it's basically talking about being mindful of knowing your students, of taking the time to establish those positive relationships, of knowing who they are. Each student obviously is an individual and has their own learner needs, but it's getting to know them as well at a cultural level, being aware of who they are, what their history is. And from then, in our case here, specifically introducing the Aboriginal perspective and keeping those differences in mind, to recognize that, yes, there are different learning styles or different cultures represented in our class, and how to best represent and implement Aboriginal resource in our classes. The next aspect in effectively incorporating intercultural change in our classrooms is through enabling languages and culture. Here, teachers enable multiple expressions of culture in their classrooms. So here, the shift is basically, the idea is from, it's a shift from being a teacher as an expert to teacher as a facilitator. And that goes back to teachers being willing to change their attitudes and behaviors, being willing to accept that we have a variety of cultures in our classroom. Each one has different perspectives, and each student has a different perspective. So it's giving our students the chance to express, to feel comfortable in class, to realize there are many differences in our classrooms, but to encourage them to share. And in this, the idea here is for us to facilitate, to encourage our students to share perspectives and as well to understand different perspectives. And through that, we'll start to see change, not only in our classroom, but in the school culture as well.
The third aspect is all about respecting and sharing power. This essentially means letting go of your control of the classroom, that you are no longer the expert. As a teacher, we show respect and sharing power through inviting alternative curriculum or community experts into our classrooms. Sharing power enables new forms of knowledge to form, allowing growth and the potential to break away from our everyday norms and biases. Respecting and sharing power often allows for more authentic learning in the classroom. By this, I mean that students are engaged in the moment, and the cultural expert may be able to dispel biases and misunderstandings by engaging with the students and answering questions, and also challenging their stereotypes in person. The last minding decision-making subcategory is arbitrating and agonizing what is just. This category is asking teachers to assume the role of social justice workers by addressing prejudicial behaviors of students toward their ethnic minority peers. Additionally, teachers are encouraged to promote the use of restitutions and interventions. Essentially, making sure the wrongdoings are addressed and corrected, and probably most importantly, ensuring that the victim participated in the restitution process.
In the implementation of Indigenous fundamental knowledge, one of teachers' responsibilities is to transform a classroom into an intercultural community and to foster both communities and relations. Intercultural communities are formed through good relations between members of different cultures. So, teachers' role is to encourage a classroom culture in which students feel free to move outside of their own circle. In this way, relationship could take root and grow. In the handout, we included 3 successful examples of fostering intercultural communities to facilitate the exchange of Aboriginal cultures in classrooms. We hope you might find some of them applicable to your classroom or might get inspired to develop activities of your own. In the subcategory of opening safe spaces, intercultural teachers are suggested to create non-judgmental and safe spaces in classroom and school for all students to negotiate intercultural learning. Intercultural learning is a developmental process that requires time, structured support, and a safe environment in which to make mistakes and to learn. Thus, intercultural teachers are suggested to recognize the value of allowing safe discussion and curricular space in which students could negotiate their perspectives with those advocated by their teacher and curriculum. In the handout, we included 2 opening safe space activities, the sharing circle and the blanket exercise, that might help Aboriginal students to share their knowledge about their own culture. It also creates opportunities for their classmates to discuss and appreciate the culture that they are not familiar with.
Protecting students and surroundings. When a teacher protects students in an intercultural teaching context, it isn't physical protection that is required as much as protecting values, identities, and a sense of belonging. This can be done in a more mindful way by providing texts and resources that help to make a cultural connection between the students' home and school lives. There are a number of really great resources in our handout, such as the math workshops that can help you do this. A very good example of this protection through responsive action is not relying on our Aboriginal students as the cultural experts for all Aboriginal people. The degree of cultural and historical knowledge that students possess varies, and singling them out in this manner increases the perceived risk of failure and could lead to a negative identity formation as the token or stereotyped Aboriginal student. This 4th subcategory of stepping up to address it refers to teachers making decisions to correct systemic racism and discriminatory practices, attitudes, or structures in schools. McPherson notes that while teachers are usually comfortable intervening in student conflicts and inappropriate behaviors, they are typically more hesitant to correct colleagues and superiors. Confronting power and discrimination becomes the responsibility of each individual teacher, and your professional code of conduct, whether it's through the ATA or another province or jurisdiction, is there to guide and support you through this process. In light of what has been shared so far, we would ask that you take a couple of minutes to pause and reflect independently or discuss with a partner what you think are some additional challenges that teachers face that could cause problems when trying to implement new and sensitive curriculum matter, such as the topic of reconciliation and the application of Indigenous foundational knowledge in the classroom.
In 2007, Dr. Yatta Kanu, a professor in University of Manitoba, published a book entitled with Integrating Aboriginal Perspectives into the School Curriculum, Purpose, Possibilities, and Challenges. In this book, Dr. Kanu mentioned 2 problems that our Aboriginal communities could help with. The first problem is that teachers experience anxiety over causing offense or controversy when integrating Aboriginal perspectives into their classroom teaching. Dr. Kanu thinks that community could provide reliable and useful materials about the Aboriginal so as to guarantee the accuracy of the knowledge. She also thought that communities could contribute to develop a system to distribute such materials into schools because, according to her research, most of the existing materials are not delivered to the hands of the teachers. The second problem that community can help with is the standing lack of funding problem. Dr. Kanu thinks the Aboriginal community can help to make the resources and Aboriginal expertise more accessible so that schools do not need to spend a lot of money funding such resources. The reason why we include this slide here is to address the importance of getting Aboriginal communities into this change of action. Teachers should know that they might get more authentic materials and effective help from Aboriginal communities.
Dylan Williams states that changing what teachers do is more important than changing what they know. Similarly, Milne comments that professional development raises awareness, but does not necessarily change classroom practices. We hope that we have not only raised your awareness through this workshop, but additionally provided you with some practical tools and resources to help you get started. In an effort to provide you with some structured accountability, we invite you to reflect on what has been shared today and work towards creating your own professional plan of action for implementing Indigenous foundational knowledge in your classrooms and schools. Thank you for your interest and participation in this workshop. If you have any questions or concerns regarding anything discussed in this presentation, please feel free to email one of us below. Additionally, don't forget to check out our Google Drive folder with the original presentation that was put into this video, as well as a PDF version of the handout of resources and supports.